Hi, everyone, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm Alex Giannini, the Associate Program Director here at the Westport Library. Tonight's event is one I've been looking forward to for a while now, featuring an author and journalist whose work I enjoy quite a bit, and a topic that has been a bit of an obsession for me. Before I introduce Abraham Riesman, though, just a quick note. If you have a question for Abraham, please type that question in the Q&A feature below us. And now we get on to the show. Abraham Riesman is a journalist and essayist, as well as the author of the biography True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. He was a longtime staffer at New York Magazine and its culture site Vulture, and his work has also appeared in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, Vice, the New Republic, and elsewhere. He is at work on his second book, Ringmaster, The Life and Times of Vince McMahon. Abe lives in Providence, Rhode Island with his spouse and their 3 cats. So please welcome Abraham Riesman.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Oh,
Scenic, Connecticut, just next door.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm excited for this, and really can't wait to dive into the book itself. But
please hit me.
If we could we start before the beginning of the book? And from what I understand, the project kind of started out as a misunderstanding with an editor.
There was a misunderstanding with an editor, yes. Just, confusion is often the place where the most incredible insights come from. So basically, I was on staff at New York Magazine. It was late 2015 or August 2015. And an editor, a wonderful guy named David Wallace Wells, who has subsequently written this tremendous book about climate change. He was one of the editors there at the time. He walks over to my desk, slaps down a galley copy of Stan Lee's 2015 graphic memoir, Amazing, Fantastic, Incredible, puts it on my desk. He says, you should do something with this. So David's a big deal editor at New York Magazine as of this point, and I had not been there that long, and I'd been writing about the comic book industry a fair amount, but like the fact that he noticed me at all just made me all, a flutter. And I started working on a profile. I started calling up sources and doing research, et cetera, et cetera. About a week into doing that, I go into David's office to give him an update on what's going on. I get about 10 seconds into my spiel about what I've done so far. And he says, oh, I meant you should write a short review. Like there was no directive to actually write this profile. I was just completely freelancing from within the structure. So, but to his credit, he said, it sounds like you're finding some interesting stuff. So keep going, see what you can find. And so long story short, I ended up writing a profile of Stan that ran in February of 2016. And then a few years later, after that, when Stan died in November of 2018, an editor at Penguin Random House at their Crown imprint reached out to my agent about me expanding the article that I'd written, which he had read, into a full biography. So the origin initially was, let me put it this way. People always ask me, why did you pitch this? Or like, why did you decide to do this? And in both stages of the process, I was not exactly the one responsible for it. It was somebody, either me thinking someone was telling me to do it or someone actually asking me to do it. So anyway, that's my boring story about how the book came to be.
Yeah, well, I mean, once you kind of get down that road, was there a moment of realization when you were confident that you had a book? Because I mean,
yes, that's
yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Great question. Yeah, no, the moment when I was like, oh, this will actually work out, maybe, was when I had it was about 40 days ish after Stan died, when I went to the apartment of Larry Lieber, Stan Lee's brother, who was 87 at the time. And we had a 4-hour interview. It was just me and him in his studio apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan for about 4 hours. And I walked out of that room going, okay, well, there's stuff here that can actually turn into a story. He kept saying the magic words that every interviewer always wants to hear, which are, I've never told anyone this, but, and I got a lot of interesting stuff that very prominently fits into the book. And yeah, and there were a lot of moments beyond that where you would go like, okay, well, at least it's always an interview. Sometimes it's finding a document, but for me, just the way I work, the most unclenching I can do is after I get a really good interview and have that on the books, then you can go, okay, well, this is moving forward.
Yeah, it's and I'd like to get into Larry a little bit later, but I mean, it's interesting because he was kind of there at the beginning, obviously, and there at the very end. And boy, does he turn into not turn into a character. He's an actual person.
He's a real person. No, but I mean, in the context of narrative nonfiction, in that sense, yeah, he's somebody who stood out. I mean, right from the beginning of the research and then all throughout it. I knew that Larry was going to be an enormous part of this book, and I'm very grateful to him for the time that he gave me. It was that interview, and then we did another one that was about an hour and a half. He's an older man and really was very generous with his time, and I think the book prospers for it.
And do you trust his memory?
That's a great question. I present everything in there that he told me that couldn't be independently verified as Larry's words, and I provide as much context as I can to try and see what really happened. But this gets at the larger problem of being a biographer, journalist, historian, whatever, which is, you're relying on people's memories, and those are not necessarily reliable. That said, he seemed there. If there was something he was reaching for, I was less confident about using that. But a lot of these things, he seemed to have at least a very distinct memory. Whether the memory is accurate, he was definitely firm in believing this is what had happened.
Obviously, just reading it on the page, his words ring the most true. I think as going through the book, it just I don't know. He just seems like he's coming from an honest.
This is a huge part of being a journalist, is you have to just sort of sometimes make these educated, but at some level gut decisions about whether you think somebody is trustworthy or not. And, it's trust but verify. But with Larry, the sense I always got was he didn't have much of an agenda there was no clear incentive for him to lie to me about a whole lot of this stuff. He doesn't care about his role in the comics industry. He doesn't care about his reputation. He didn't have to be protecting Stan's image because Stan was gone, and also they'd had a difficult relationship. So, there were things he told me off the record that aren't used, but were, more evidence of the kind of stuff that he was talking about. And I don't know. I'll just leave it at saying I'm really glad Larry spoke with me, and there were a lot of leads he gave me that led to more payoffs. And I think his stories were just fascinating. I mean, there's the one about his brother, about Stan trying to pay him to park his car, which I remember transcribing that or reading the transcript of it and just going, this is the most, I'm Jewish, and it felt that like this very like Jewish Altekocker, like old Jewish men arguing about something story. And I only point that out just to say it's this very like tender, even though it's this anecdote. Sorry, I'm realizing most people have not read the book. I'm talking to you who has, but at one point in the 60s, Stan almost hired his brother to park his car for him for $5 a week. And Larry was very insulted by this low price. And then later Stan complained to somebody else, a third party, that, that schmuck brother of mine, I tried to pay him $15 a week to park my car, and he says no. And then Larry goes on, like, talks to the third party and says, first of all, it was $5 a week. It was not $15 a week. And if it was $15 a week, then he could just park it in a lot. So I was like, I have to include this as a block quote. Like, you have to just get this sense of the lived humanity of these people. Anyway, I could talk about Larry all day, but
I definitely want to get back to him because I have more questions about him. But I guess
please.
But that's such a major point, because you say it, that Stan lies about little things and he lies about not so little things. And that $5 to $15 when he's telling friends, it's a little thing, right? But it's kind of a much more telling.
But it's indicative of a much larger problem that you have in your relationship with your own brother. I know, his only brother, his only sibling. And they had, but it was just little fibs here and there that would pile up, and that can really be difficult for a relationship.
Yeah. So the book split into three parts: Ambition and Its Discontents, which is before the advent of the Marvel Universe. Then there's Mr. Marvel, which takes us through the Kirby years and into the late 90s. And then the final part, Get Rich Quick, which is really some sad and heavy stuff. I do want to try to talk about each of the parts a little bit. But
sure.
One of the things that struck me, that across all parts, the book does a lot of things that defy the nature, I think, of such a book, because there have been so many books and movies and documentaries, right, about Stan. And I think comics fans especially have pretty much seemingly heard it all when it comes to Stan, but you managed to cover some new ground, and the beginning of the book is especially interesting because you delve into Stan's family history, which I'd never read about before. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So a lot of that I'm glad you enjoyed, because it was purely because I found it interesting. I'm Jewish, like I said, and Stan was Jewish, but had a very unknown Jewish background. There was nothing really written. It was known that his parents were, sorry, that's my cat. Silence you. It was, he had Romanian Jewish parents, immigrant parents, that was known. But beyond that, there really wasn't any available information. So I talked to Larry and I did my own genealogical research and hired a genealogist to help me out because there are databases and methods that were so arcane, I would never know them. And I, found distant relatives and so on and so forth, and found this really interesting portrait of a family that had originated on both his mother's and father's side in eastern Romania. Not the parents did not know each other there, but they were in same rough region, and both came to the U.S. during this period of intense and notorious throughout the world of Jews anti-Semitism in Romania. Romania in the first decade of the 20th century was sort of the hotbed of anti-Semitism in Europe. And, his parents were refugees. They escaped from this brutal oppression, and both of them remained openly Jewish. And his dad, especially Jack, was very proudly Jewish, went to synagogue, not super regularly, but enough, and was very passionate about the state of Israel and any number of other aspects of mid-century Jewish life, early 20th century Jewish life into mid-century. And Stan was just completely uninterested in that. Stan wanted nothing to do with his family and really nothing to do with Judaism and Jewishness and the Jewish community. This is not a crime or anything. It's just, sorry, excuse me. It's just interesting that this was something that hadn't really been explored before. And, there had been things written about Stan's Jewishness, but it was always in the context of looking for Jewish themes in the superhero comics of the 60s that Stan was credited on. And nobody had really bothered to do a lot of deep digging into what his actual background was in that regard. And, you don't want to do too much armchair psychology, but it does start to paint this interesting picture of a guy who was very distanced from a cold and difficult father who, although he was cold and difficult, he was very passionate about being Jewish and really tried to impose that onto his sons. And neither of them did it take. And Stan in particular, really, he married a non-Jewish woman. He married an Episcopalian English woman, and they had their daughter baptized. And that was, Larry described the act of telling Jack about the baptism as cruelty. It was a very big rift between the two of them, Stan and his father. And also Stan's pursuit of not being like that and not being restricted to the concept of Jewishness meant that he could be a beloved relative of anybody. He was obviously white, but even then he was so deracinated. There were so few specifics of his background or the way he talked about his childhood or his identity that you could just project yourself into his family and vice versa.
Interesting. I mean, I guess a theme that kind of runs throughout his life is not, I don't want to say necessarily running away from his current standing, but I mean, it does.
Oh,
happen, right?
sure. No, absolutely that. Yes. Yeah. I mean, throughout his life, according to everybody, including Larry talking about when Stan was very young, Stan really wanted to be somebody and wanted to escape the circumstances into which he had been born. He's born in 1922 in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Quickly, the family moves to Washington Heights and then up to the Bronx. And, he's growing up in the lower middle class, not dirt poor, but not doing super great. His dad was a dress cutter, which was an important job, but then fell on hard times during the Great Depression, started a diner. The diner didn't work out. Stan was working from a very young age. And that's actually how, forgive me, I'm going a little off topic here, but talk about family background.
Mhm.
That's how Stan ended up in the comics industry was through nepotism. I mean, just, I don't mean that as a diss. That was just how business was done. He had an uncle, who was, brother of his mother. And, he had a cousin, Gene Davis, who was married to a guy, and both of those guys worked at this one publishing company. The cousin-in-law was Martin Goodman, who owned the publishing company, and the uncle was Robbie Solomon, who worked there as kind of a all-purpose right-hand man type of guy for Martin Goodman. And Stan just got a job there randomly. Stan had no love of the comics medium, really, in any particular way. When he was a teenager, he got a job running errands and doing erasures and, filling coffee for this company that was owned by his cousin-in-law and where his uncle worked. It was just, his uncle saying to saying to the editor-in-chief of the time, like, my sister's kid is coming by, just give him something to do. And that was the beginning of the Marvel Comics revolution in some ways, was him getting picked up at this company that he really didn't have any particular love for, but it was part of his family. And that was stuff that people just weren't really aware of before I started writing about it, which there wasn't as much out there as I would have liked to there have been. Sure. I should not diss. There are other people who had done research into Martin Goodman and such.
No, and that's one of the things about the book that I find you did such a great job with it. It's just kind of balancing that line between, because there's so many books about Stan, you have to satiate the Marvel fan base, right, with something new, but also like it's a book that the general public's going to be interested in. So how was that approach for you?
That's just what I've been trying to do with all of my writing about the comic book industry in the past better part of a decade. I try to write for my imagined reader as well. I try not to think of one reader. I try to be as open to a certain swath as I could. And especially with this book, I wanted to reach out to people who had no interest in comics whatsoever, no familiarity whatsoever. Probably ideally somebody who has maybe seen a Marvel movie and has been aware of the fact that there's a guy named Stan Lee. But even then, I wanted it to be accessible just as an interesting story. So, the trick to that I've found in my life is just ask yourself dumb questions while you're writing. Like while you're writing a sentence, go, well, what are the ways that this could be misconstrued by somebody who doesn't know the material that well? And the other way to think about it for me is always just imagine I'm at a party and describing this chapter to somebody. Like, I don't know who this person is that I'm talking to at the party. I'm just trying to engage them. And so I just follow my instincts about, okay, well, what's something that this person that I'm imagining at a party might not know about the comics industry? Well, I better explain that if I haven't already said it. But, a lot of it's gut instinct. You also don't want to insult anybody's intelligence. So that's why you have editors. You include whatever level of detail seems appropriate, and then they'll tell you if they need to dial it down or turn it up. But thank you for saying that, because that is the goal, was I wanted it to be accessible for lay people as well.
Yeah, for sure. One of the other things, and just to go back to it a little bit, something new for me was I'd always heard Stan Lee saying that, before the Fantastic Four and the Marvel Revolution, he was tired of comics and he was looking for a way out, right? But I guess through your research and stuff, I think you found it was much more than that. He was miserable before.
He really did not like working in comics. No, he enjoyed that he was like, he liked the money and he liked that he was good at it, so he could do it pretty quickly. I mean, Larry tells an anecdote about how, not even an anecdote, just an observation of a thing that happened pretty regularly while he was living with Stan briefly after the death of their father. Stan would, go to his typewriter, bang out a script in 20 minutes, and then yell to everybody in the house, I did it. I wrote a Western in 20 minutes. Like it was just something to get through. And by his own admission, he would not even really think about the stories before he sat down at the typewriter. He would just crank stuff out. He really did not like the comics industry and did a lot to try to escape it. I mean, right after he gets out of the war, where, he didn't see combat, but he was off doing writing training films and such and posters. He immediately tries to start a textbook business with Bennett Cerf of Random House. And then he tries to, get into advertising or into film and television or writing newspaper comic strips, anything. And then, that even continues after the Marvel Revolution. You'll have, in 1963, him putting out You Don't Say, this compilation of captioned news photographs, with witty little barbs and such about whatever was happening in the news photograph. He was doing those after all of these Marvel comics have come out and started to tear the world apart. in a good way. He just didn't. And then after that, he was always trying to make it in Hollywood. I mean, comics and superhero stories were not a particular passion for him. They just happened to sort of be where he'd ended up.
Do you think it's a much larger question, but do you think he was ever happy at any point in his life?
That's I can't say,
Right.
I don't know. The closest I can get to answering that question. I mean, is anybody happy? I mean, it's an American story. We're always looking for the next rung on the ladder. We're very rarely satisfied with where we are, but um, you know, he certainly took joy in friends and sometimes in family. By family, I mean his wife mainly, and sometimes his daughter, who he had a very rocky relationship with. But when it came to professional satisfaction, I don't know that he ever really felt it. I don't think he did. I mean, right up until the end. I mean, I've heard recordings of him in his latter few years talking about how angry he was that his second post-Marvel company, POW Entertainment, had failed to produce a hit for him.
Yeah.
So, he was still frustrated right up until the very end when it came to his professional accomplishments.
Do you think he was able to view his life's work as a success, though? I mean, because it does seem like a lot of him was dollars and cents, right?
Yeah, well, there's that too. I mean, a lot of it was personal fulfillment because we all want that. And we all want to be famous and loved. But also, yeah, he had to keep working to keep liquid cash flow happening because and it's always weird to talk about because you sound weird saying it. But according to everybody, including Stan, both his wife and his daughter, Joan and JC, are very profligate. Well, Joan is no longer with us, but were very profligate spenders. They would spend a lot of money on their shopping habits, tens of thousands of dollars a month. And although Stan got a lifetime salary from Marvel, it wasn't that much, and he didn't have a percentage of the movies, and he wasn't getting, he was an executive producer, quote unquote, on the movies, but was not actually making any money off of them. So he was, out there hustling until the very last few months of his life, out there going to conventions and trying to, and selling signatures, selling photos, and doing appearances that he got paid for because he had to keep the money faucet on.
And he was surprisingly open about that. I guess he and JC were on a show, right? It was like a father-daughter.
Yeah, yeah. Occasionally he would say stuff weirdly about how his wife and daughter spent a lot of money, and it would just end up in the public record. And it's there are all these things that Stan would say like that, where he would, um, you know, acknowledge something that you'd think would be very private, and he'd say it in this semi-joking tone, so you'd think, well, does he mean it or not? Yeah. For example, that was, I believe, 1979. He was on this local New York show where they had some notable cultural figures and their daughters appearing for Father's Day, or something. Maybe it was kids in general. I don't know if they were all daughters. And yeah, and he just talked about how she spends all of his money. They appeared on it, and and then later, like I went to a press conference he did in 2015 where he would talk about how it's just like he was talking about a collaborator of his. It's the best thing in the world. He does all the work and I take all the credit, which of course is, as we'll get into, I'm sure, like the main accusation leveled against Stan. But that was the kind of guy he was. He would joke about stuff that was actually quite serious and say things half jokingly that were, would have been really shocking admissions if he'd said them totally seriously.
Yeah, he really he would take the air out of the balloon before he'd pop it, so you
It's
wouldn't really
very weird.
know.
Yeah. I mean, not weird. It's a human tendency,
Yeah.
but not my approach.
So I get just getting back to his ambivalence at best, I guess, towards comics.
Yes, right, about the comics
Do
industry,
you,
right.
do you think he ever was concerned with progressing the art form or advancing it the way that like Jack Kirby was?
Not in the same way as Jack, I don't think. He was content to be a trend chaser for the most part. Um, and when it came to the Marvel Revolution of the 60s, that's where it gets complicated because it's certainly possible that Stan had this hot streak where he had some ideas in the 60s, in the early 60s, when these characters were first really being formed, that really just changed the course of popular culture. And that, they started with him and then went into artistic collaboration with Jack Kirby. But there is the possibility that those characters, as we're going to get into, I'm sure, were created solely by Jack. So it's hard to. Well, I shouldn't get too deep down in that hole. Or did you want to bring that
Yeah,
up later?
Yeah, well, I was getting to it. Just to before we get into the characters that
Yeah.
the creation of Stan Lee as a character.
Yes, the
When
character
when does
Stanley. Yeah.
that light bulb go off, and when does he really start focusing on that?
That's so interesting. It's not any one light bulb. The character of Stan Lee you see develop from his very first, his very first credit, which was it's credited to Stan Lee, not his birth name. He was born Stanley Martin Lieber. But, in 1940, 41, there's this text piece that appears in a Marvel comic. It was called Timely at the time, a Timely comic written by somebody named Stan Lee. And that pen name right there, that's the beginning of the character. And then you get little bits and bobs throughout the years. Like, he does like a cover story for Writer's Digest that's written in this kind of beginnings of what would sound like the Stan Lee voice later. And, he sort of creates this narrator character in this little booklet that he put together called Secrets of the Comics. And then in the 60s, obviously, you start to get the letters pages and the narration boxes where he's addressing the reader directly. And that was a real development in the voice. But even then, he still looked very different. I mean, I remember being in the Stanley Archives in Laramie, Wyoming, which we can get into if you want, and watching an old film strip that had been put into VHS of Stan in 1965 pitching this Marvel cartoon. And he's completely bald, no glasses, no facial hair, and he's speaking in this monotone, like, "Hello, my name is Stan Lee, editor of the Marvel Comics Group." And you're like, wow, it's 1965. Marvel has taken off, and he really has not started doing the character, at least in person yet, visually or auditorially. But in the letters pages, that character is really getting fully formed as of the 60s. And only in the 70s did he start to visually and in terms of audio, really get to the character that we think of him as now, in a slightly younger form. But even when he was old in his 90s, we still sort of imagined him being in his 70s,
Yeah.
60s or 70s.
It was interesting too, because that moment when you talk about that in the archives, which I do want to talk about, but
Mhm.
that monotone voice. I mean, I think we all just hear Stan's voice when we
Yeah,
read.
everybody can do the voice if you're familiar with him. Yeah.
It was striking that it wasn't always that.
No, it definitely was not always that. No.
So, and then just why are the archives in Wyoming?
So around 1980, 81, there was a director of the American Heritage Center at the University of Wyoming, which is this collection of archives of cultural figures, who was aware of Stan and reached out to him about donating his papers and recordings and effects, etc., to the American Heritage Center. And 1980 is a bit of an ebb point in Stan's career. I mean, he's been out in Hollywood trying to get stuff made, and it hasn't really been working. He just moved to Hollywood full time, and there would be some success, but he was no longer writing these comics and was not experiencing that kind of fresh rush that he'd been having before. And he had not yet achieved the mainstream recognition that would come with the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the other Marvel movie successes years later. So there weren't a whole lot of people asking, is what I'm trying to say. University of Wyoming just happened to be the people who asked. And when they were running down the list of other people who had their archives stored there, one of them was Jack Benny. And Stan was a big Jack Benny fan, perhaps unsurprisingly, Jack Benny being the radio star. And so he said, if it's good enough for Jack Benny, it's good enough for me. And so now his archives are, perhaps somewhat unsurprisingly, are only available if you fly to Denver and then take one of the two flights that happen every day from Denver to Laramie, Wyoming. And then for free, you can go to the reading room of the American Heritage Center, as I did, and get things scanned and digitized and watch them. There's a lot of stuff there. They donated almost 200 boxes. It's about 100, I think it's 194 boxes of Stan Lee's things. And it's everything from papers to notes to himself to audio reel to reels to VHS tapes. I mean, home movies. They have home movies that they shot on camcorder, and they just have them sitting there. And I'm glad they did. It really helped fill out the portrait.
Very interesting. And I'm assuming, were they giving that stuff to the
Yeah, every whenever they would send boxes to the American Heritage Center all the way up until about 2011.
Interesting. It was some weird stuff too, right? Like his daughter had these like ambient sound
Yeah,
recordings.
there were these like weird cassette tapes that I think they just sort of were grabbing up by the bushel and
Wow.
saying, well, let's just get rid of these. Although I could be wrong. I have no idea. But yeah, there would just be ambient sound recordings made by their daughter, JC, in the 70s. It's a weird collection. Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, but somehow fitting, right? It just seems like it makes sense somehow. I don't
I
know.
know. I know. It certainly makes for an interesting story. I'll put
Yeah.
it that way.
So let's get into the real meat of the second part of the book and,
Mhm.
and the dawning of the Marvel Revolution, right? So I think you hit it right on the head that you say it's here that everything started to change, and it's here too that everything gets well and truly complicated. So my question is, how frustrating was it to do this research
I was
about?
actually, it was kind of exciting. I love being able to come at it. Here's why it wasn't that frustrating. The path had already been trod for a lot of the stuff about creator credit because there are people who are so obsessed with the dispute between Stanley and Jack Kirby about who created the characters and who was really writing the comics. I stand on the shoulders of giants, of very obsessive giants who spend a lot of time on Facebook and on HTML websites putting up evidence in favor of Kirby.
Mhm.
And I'm not saying my book agrees with them in their 100%, pro Kirby sympathies, but it was actually kind of fun to delve into the world of this Talmudic argument that had been happening for decades among the really hardcore comics heads. I mean, these are the people who were like on Jack Kirby email lists and like on Usenet talking about this stuff. And they're all amateurs. I mean, nobody's making their money doing this. They all have day jobs, and yet they've put all of this effort into collecting all this information. So when it came to looking at the creator credit controversy,
Mhm.
that was more just going through a blizzard of information as opposed to going like, I mean, at a certain point, I had to just sort of accept that I wasn't going to solve the mystery 100%. I mean, there's not going to be a smoking gun where there's a note that Stan wrote to himself saying, I ripped off Jack Kirby today, mwah, ha ha ha. You're not going to find anything like that. And if there were presentation boards that Jack put together, those certainly haven't survived. And there's no, it's just there's no contemporaneous. We're not gonna find the proof of that. So once you can accept that, then it's just an exciting adventure to try and look at the way the story changed and all of the circumstantial evidence that surrounds it. So that actually was not that frustrating. If anything, it was a fun challenge.
But it's I mean it's the weird combination too of just Stan's bombast, right, and really to the changing story. I mean it
Sure.
blamed on bad memory and up to just not really caring
Falsehood.
about
Yeah.
credit, right? But then there's the Jack Kirby way of speaking, which is so weird.
Yeah, he was a very elliptical speaker and thinker. I mean, to his benefit in terms of the creativity that he put out, but also to his detriment in terms of having a coherent story about his life. And yeah, I mean, you look at Jack's accounts of how the Marvel Universe was created, and you can't help but be struck by the fact that like he says stuff that's just not true. Now, whether that's just because of the weird way he thought, or because he misremembered, or whatever, it's hard to know. He died in 1994, but yeah, you want, if you are the kind of person who is a diehard pro Kirbyite, you want to find in his words that smoking gun. But if anything, he just muddies the waters more. He'll say, for me, the point of that the Fantastic Four were about the bomb and getting blown up in an atomic blast, and that's not how they get their powers, or like that they're the youths, and it's like, well, everybody's an adult basically except for Johnny Storm. I mean, there are all these, and then there's the bigger thing where he says he created all these characters right when he came back to Marvel in 1958. Well, these characters don't start to appear until like 1961 to 63. So why would he have just been sitting on it for 3 years? I'm not saying haha, I have proof that Jack Kirby lied about everything. I'm just saying that's gets at the larger question of how you have to just sort of go, I'm not going to know the answer to this. There's not going to be a conclusive answer in this book. This is going to be me assembling as much evidence for either case as I can.
Yeah, I mean, and there's also the Comics Journal interview that he gives with Gary
Sure.
Clark.
And yeah, 1989, published in 90.
And it's weird because even when he's talking about his childhood, you're like, well, they didn't fight on rooftops and fall off the roof. I mean, it's really all over the place.
Right. Or like saying that he fought, he went to, landed in Normandy 10
Right.
days after D-Day, and it was months after D-Day, actually, as it turned out. But like, he said that he could still see bodies on the beaches from people who'd just been killed, which was unlikely. And said that he created the Incredible Hulk after he saw a woman lift a car up to save a child, which could have happened, but is extremely improbable. I hate to break people's hearts, but you don't really have the easily provable one honest man when it comes to looking at Jack Kirby's words. It's a lot of it doesn't really add up.
And I guess you kind of answered it, but going in, I'm sure you had your opinion, right? So you don't have to say what that is, obviously, but so that's how you did it. You just went in and said, well, whatever I find out here is
Whatever I find, and then try and assemble it into as coherent a narrative as I could. And unfortunately, like I said, it's not a perfect narrative. I don't have the answer, but there are people who had access to a lot more information and time and resources than I did who tried. I mean, there was a legal case with the Kirby family that almost went to the Supreme Court in 2014.
right.
That accumulated a lot of evidence, went through a lot of levels of discovery, and nobody found anything that really conclusively proved anything. So it's frustrating because that means the historical record has to be a question mark, but I'd rather it be a question mark than a false exclamation point,
Right. Was there anything in your research that you came across that just really surprised you? I mean, maybe something you didn't know going in.
Sure. Well, the thing that jumps out, of course, is, if we're talking specifically about Marvel, not much, because most of that was stuff that
Sure.
had been pretty trod, but about the specific topic. But when it came to Stan in general, two things stood out. One was speaking of what we're talking about with the Jewish background, Larry talking about these letters that their father, Jack Lieber, would mail to Jack and rather to Stan and Larry, sort of excoriating them for not being Jewish enough and not, observing the holidays, not going to synagogue, not supporting the state of Israel. I found that fascinating. It's such an interesting, weird relationship to have where your father is writing you angry letters about how you're not doing enough for the Jewish people. That was interesting. And surprised me. But the thing that really surprised me, of course, was hearing the audio tapes that I referenced near the end of the book or not tapes, recordings rather, of Stan, probably not aware that he's being recorded, although I don't know for certain. And just yelling obscenities at his daughter or about his daughter, or being paranoid and thinking he needs to get a gun to defend himself from his former road manager, just really upsetting stuff. And I heard that was not me reading transcripts. I heard this audio with my own 2 ears played out of a laptop by a former associate of Stan's. And I just didn't expect what I heard, because not only was it obscene, but there were racist and homophobic moments as well. And I just didn't expect that. That was not something that I had walked in necessarily anticipating. And like I say in the book, it reminds you that a person's true self is always going to be just beyond the writer's grasp,
Yeah. One of the things that I didn't know was the Carnegie Hall event.
Oh yeah. 1971. Yeah.
And that was like just a weird, like, acid trippy thing.
Totally weird. I have a friend who wants to write a screenplay just about various, like, Detroit Rock City style, like people converging at the Carnegie Hall night. But yeah. Stan and this promoter named Steve Lemberg put together this one night only performance at Carnegie Hall in the early 70s where Stan was the guy. It was a night with Stan Lee, basically. And it was this weird motley crew, not Motley Crue, but an actual motley crew of performers doing Stan related stuff. It wasn't even all Marvel necessarily, but you had Stan's wife and daughter reading a poem that Stan wrote. You had Roy Thomas, his protege, his rock band playing while people dressed in costumes drew and dancers danced. Tom Wolfe spoke. Rene Auberjonois, the actor, spoke. The world's tallest man was there.
He left, right?
Yeah, what'd you say again?
The war, didn't he weep because he was playing
And he
Carnegie?
wept because he was at Carnegie Hall. He was just so excited that he could be there. And the whole thing was a disaster. Like nobody had a good time. That guy was probably the only person who enjoyed himself because he got to be inside Carnegie Hall. Everybody else, I mean, people were booing and throwing things. It was just an ill-conceived attempt at an evening's entertainment. But yeah, it was very interesting because it was indicative of like where Stan was at as of the early 70s, which was he'd really achieved more fame than he ever thought he would through these comics, and wanted to translate that into being fame for just himself.
Hmm.
Not necessarily out of selfishness. He obviously, you know, spread around the credit insofar as he put in credits boxes so people knew who the pencilers, inkers, and letterers were, and he would talk up the writer artists as great artists, although not so much as great writers all that often, at least especially later. But you know, he really did have a vision of promoting himself. And that Carnegie Hall night is a great example of him doing that, and also of it not really working out so much for him.
It's that very strange dichotomy of Stan Lee, where he does give credit, in the books themselves, literally on the page.
Sure, right
Right?
on the page.
Yeah, and then yeah, very very interesting. And then he I lost my train of thought here, but he
No, take your time.
no. So one of the quotes that stuck out was Marvel writer Jerry Conway saying
Sure.
that he's a good guy, he's just not a great guy. And I thought that
Yes.
was that indicative of the way that his peers saw
That
him.
was how a lot of people spoke about him. People who worked closely with him, there would often, especially in the comics industry in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, you had a lot of people who, well, he was mostly really doing comics leadership stuff in 60s and 70s of the people I've spoken to. And they would often give you responses that were basically, I recognize everything that Stan did that helped me, that
Mhm.
helped the industry, that helped my friends. He was a nice guy. He was kind to me, blah, blah, blah. Gave credits when other people didn't. But at the same time, they'll all recognize his shortcomings, you know, things that they think he did that were they're not happy about. So it was a very concise version of something that I heard from a lot of people, which was, yeah, he's a good guy. He was great to me. He was great to a lot of people. He changed people's lives. But was he a great guy? It's hard to say, you know.
Right. Right.
People,
And so the thought that just flew out of my brain was that he also kind of, you get the sense that he carried the weight of keeping people employed and had to go through these firings, right? So
yeah.
that seemed like, and maybe it's because he comes out of the Depression era and all that, but you get the feeling that he does genuinely care about the people he works with. But then there,
Yeah, for the most part, you don't get the sense that he really disliked them. I mean, there were certainly a lot of editors out there who were just terrible bosses and very abusive to their
Mhm.
freelancers and staff, and that wasn't Stan. You know, Stan had his disputes with people, but for the most part, at least in terms of interpersonal interactions, he was regarded as a pretty genial and jolly guy to work with. And you know, that was very much to his benefit. You can argue that his greatest strength was that he was a great editor, you know, and a great boss. um
Yeah, even
you
Jack
know,
Kirby, right? I mean, he was
except for Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. But sorry, what were you going to say?
well, no, but even with Kirby, like they were even cordial. Kirby was even
Yeah,
polite
sure.
around Stanley, right?
No,
So
they
it was that weird
Stan
person.
and Jack Stan and Jack were totally capable of being gentlemen around each other, despite all of their terrible differences. It could get awkward. You know, there's this infamous maybe interview they did on WBAI, the New York radio station, and in the 80s, after they'd been estranged for a while. And you know, they start out cordial and then it ends up being awkward and them sort of snipping at each other. But you know, they'd see each other at cons and get along fine, sort of. But that's neither here nor there to a certain extent. The point is that Stan was very easy to deal with and a lot more pleasant than a lot of his peers in the world of running a comic book company.
Yeah, I guess the two that really stick out, right, are Ditko and Wally Wood, who Wally Wood
Yes.
hated Stan.
Wally really did not. I mean, they didn't work together that much, but it was
Yeah.
so unpleasant when they did. Wally Wood being one of the writer artists to work on Daredevil in the early years. And he was the guy who came up with Daredevil having the all red costume and having the little Billy Club with the rope thing in there. He he like, well, I guess we haven't really talked about the Marvel method here, but I should have. These comics, just so everybody knows, were not being written from a script by Stan Lee. Stan Lee was not, this was not like a screenplay for a movie. That is usually how comics are supposed to be done, is you write a full script and the writer says, in this panel, I want this to be happening and these words to appear. And this is what I want to be visually happening in the next one, blah, blah, blah. Stan didn't do that. He had this sort of triage method that later came to be known as the Marvel method, where he would have some kind of discussion with a writer artist. Then the writer artist would go home and take the notes from their discussion in his head, or if he wrote something down, we don't know where it is, but maybe it did exist at some point, and actually do the first draft of the story, but do it through the form of drawing the pages with little annotations and suggestions in the margins. And then Stan would get those pages, critique them, get changes, whatever, and then he would add in the dialogue and narration. And the question is always, okay, well, what was happening in that initial conversation? And we don't know. Those records don't survive if there were many to begin with. We just have the words of the people who were in those meetings. And a lot of the writer artists will say that Stan was very, effusive and had ideas and blah, blah, blah. But they will all say that, they were limited. It was not a script. He would say, here are some ideas for what I want to have happen in this issue. And then there were people like Jack and Ditko who, according to them, would just say, here's what I'm going to do, Stan. And then they would go do it. With Ditko, it even got to the point where they weren't even having those initial conversations. They were so estranged that Ditko would just draw the pages without any prior discussion with Stan, then hand them to Stan, and Stan would then come up with the dialogue and narration, which certainly makes him the main writer of those stories. Not the only writer. Stan's dialogue and narration is crucial, but it's not the same as what you might expect given the credits that were on those comics, which would be like script by Stan Lee or written by Stan Lee or story by Stan Lee. And that just wasn't, and the artist would just be listed 9 times out of 10 as drawn by or illustrated by or penciled by artist. And that was not the case. That was not exactly what was happening.
But the people involved also further complicate this, and this is where I really don't envy you as biographer, because Steve Ditko is notoriously and famously was a difficult human to get along with.
Well, right? Here's the thing. I didn't get to talk to Ditko. I tried to one time for a profile that I wrote of him.
Great profile, yeah.
Thank you. In 2016, when Doctor Strange came out, because he invented Doctor Strange. Stan later took credit for that, but that there's documentation of pretty much
in
contemporaneous. Well, not so much in going back to when Doctor Strange was introduced. There's a letter that Stan wrote to this fanzine writer, Jerry Bales, in which he says that they're about to do this thing called Doctor Strange. 'Twas Steve's idea. And he doesn't even like the idea in the letter. Stan's like, this is not a good idea, but we're doing it anyway. And it's Steve's idea. It's not mine. And then later, of course, Stan would say that he came up with Doctor Strange, but that's one of the rare instances where we have Stan sort of openly saying earlier on that that's not how it went. But yeah, Ditko was not an easy guy to get in touch with. He receded from the spotlight. He did not want to be famous. He did not want to talk to the press. He did he did his last interview in like 1968. He just stopped doing them and would issue these sort of missives, these essays through pamphlets through his friend Robin Snyder. You could only get them via mail order. You still can't get them digitally, and they're mostly out of print now. But he would write these essays about like his side of things and how things actually went. And that was about as close as you could get. I went to his office. He had an office in New York all the way up until the end when he died in his 90s, and just a few months, just a few months apart from when Stan died. And, yeah, I didn't get to talk to him. I knocked on his door. He opened it at one point and looked at me. I said, Mr. Ditko. And before I could get to the end of the words, Mr. Ditko, he had already closed the door in my face and I left. So that was about it. But
Saw the face of Ditko. So
I did gaze upon the face of Ditko. He looked like Uncle Junior from The Sopranos.
and I guess he went. He had stacks and stacks of original.
That's what I didn't see any of that, but people who, because he would invite people into his office. That was the reason why I went. Was there were a lot of stories of people going and knocking on his door and him letting them in and just like talking to them. It just has to be off the record.
Right.
He won't let you record anything, and he won't let you do an interview. But he would talk to people for hours about his personal views on philosophy and politics and comics and everything. It's he was an interesting guy, very different from Stan.
Yeah, and I guess the other part you'd mentioned it about how the artists would write notes in the like in around the panel
margins, yeah.
But sometimes they wouldn't at all, and then other times, I mean, I've seen Kirby original art where he's literally dictating the story.
He's dictating the story and the dialogue in some cases, even. Yeah, I mean, it varied. It was a very loosey-goosey industry. This was not a firmly set up assembly line in the way that it sort of is now. I mean, there's a lot more documentation of what's happening at every stage now. So,
as we got about 10 minutes left, and if you have questions, I see one. I'll get to that one, I promise. Please put them in the Q&A. I kind of want to loop back to Larry Lieber, and I wonder, there's really early on, you talk about there's a story of Stan loving to ride a bike when he was a kid, right? And then Larry says something like, well, I don't really remember him.
I don't remember him having a bike. He was like, he may have, but like, I'm sorry, where were you going with that?
No, it's two plays. Like, again, it goes to why would he lie about the bicycle? And then the second part, though, is did Larry follow his career? I mean, did he read the memoir? Because he seemed to draw that from a memoir.
Yeah, Larry read Stan wrote this memoir, or co-wrote a memoir with a celebrity biographer that came out in 2002 called Excelsior: The Amazing Life of Stan Lee. Amazing Story of Stan Lee. I can't remember all of a sudden, but Larry read it. He initially, when I was interviewing him, was like, you don't need to talk to me. You can just read the memoir, which was a very odd thing to say, given what he knew about his brother's relationship to the truth. But he'd read it, and he knew a fair amount about Stan's career, but they were not close. Stan really kept his brother at arm's length. And even though they worked together on a lot of things, including the Spider-Man newspaper strip for many years, they did not have a close relationship. So I don't really know how closely Larry tracked everything. I don't think that closely. I mean, you had moments, because also Larry didn't really like the comics industry. He liked the comics industry even less than Stan did in some ways. At least Stan could say, well, I succeeded there and they like me there. Larry has a much more complicated relationship because Larry was not famous, and Larry thinks he should have done better things than comics. But, I think he has an interesting legacy. I wanted to write his story as well, but he wouldn't let me. He wants to write a memoir, so I am not allowed to be that person, at least as of yet.
I was actually dead. That was my next point. Was that's this? I would really like to read the Larry Lieber story.
The first time that he and I spoke, it was 3 hours of him telling me his life story. Stan would come in and out, but it was not an interview. He wouldn't let me record it. He just wanted me to know his story. So he told me just this very interesting and kind of harrowing saga of who he is and what he did. And I hope he writes it down, or he gets somebody to talk to him about it that he'll let record it, because its attention must be paid.
Yeah, and boy, did he give you the greatest button to go out on with that last line.
With the line, which I won't spoil for people who haven't read the book, but yeah, he just sort of handed that. Well, the one I will say that he did, there are two old movie references he makes, and I won't say what the second one is, but the first one's in the introduction. He goes, I feel like I'm talking about Charles Foster Kane. And I'm like, you can't just say that. Like, that's too easy for me. Now I just get to use that, and I can have the Citizen Kane structure metaphor and I don't have to justify it. You said it. But anyway, yes, he loves old movies. He watches TCM all the time.
Okay, I want to get to a couple audience. Are you good on time if we go?
Yeah, sure. If we go a little bit, yeah.
So from Ron, he says he grew up in Providence. His question is, how did Stan get along with Siegel and Schuster?
Schuster of Superman. I haven't seen much record of them having a whole lot of interaction, actually. I can't, Bob Kane, the SOB who stole credit for creating Batman, I shouldn't call him an SOB. Sorry, that's mean. But still,
Mm.
he was not a pleasant man to deal with
Yeah.
in a lot of ways, and was very cruel to the person who co-created Batman with him. He and Stan got along. Bob Kane and Stan had a relationship. They weren't that close. They weren't like super tight, but they would. You have sketches in Stan's effects that are like from Bob Kane. It's like a drawing of Stan as Batman or something. So I know that they had a relationship, but Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, I don't think there really was anything like that. I mean, they were in separate worlds, and Siegel and Schuster were never made famous, in their own lifetimes, which was really unfortunate because they were really. I mean, you want to talk about people who were worse than Stan, the people who were running DC, what became DC early on when they snatched up Superman, that was worse business dealing than than at least more transparently bad than a lot of the stuff that Stan did. But I shouldn't play comparison there. But
I mean, well, two things. First, the most Bob Kane thing I've ever heard is him drawing Stan Lee as Batman, probably on a napkin, saying
yeah, that
something.
was basically it. Yeah, I mean, he was into it,
Yeah. And I guess just to follow up on that is the knowing everything that you know and doing your research, does it make it difficult to either enjoy comics, follow comics?
Yes, it does. I'm basically done with comics for right now. It feels like I'm
Yeah.
going to come back to them, but over the course of working on this book, I was like, well, I can't because now I'm not writing about comics as much. I'm working on the Vince McMahon book, so my free time, if I'm looking at pop culture, it's more often going to be something that has nothing to do with anything that I write about, or it'll be wrestling. Yeah, comics I'm kind of overdosed on right now. I'm sure I hope I come back to them because there are so many great comics out there, but I almost feel sort of allergic to looking at a comic book now, which
I,
is a first for
think,
me in my life.
but I do think you coined the phrase superhero industrial complex, but
Did I? Okay. Well, I didn't rip it off from anybody, but I'm sure somebody said it before me. I don't
I'll
know.
attribute it to you. Okay, so
Yes.
Dave has a question. What's the relationship between the book The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay and Stan Lee? Did Stan employ teenage Eastern European immigrants to create adventure comics?
So, Adventures in Cavalier and Clay, written by Michael Chabon, great book, very influential in the field and on me. It's not a one-to-one story about Stan, really at all. It's more based on Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, although neither one of them was, an immediate Eastern European immigrant refugee in the way that one of the characters is in the book. So some of Stan's experiences as a teenager in the comics industry were reflected in the construction of that story. But Chabon later wrote a short story that was very specifically based on Stan and Jack that was published in the New Yorker. But Cavalier and Clay itself was there were elements of Stan Lee's story that kind of informed it, but it was not really a Stan Lee analog.
And Michael asked the big one. After Jack Kirby left Marvel at the end of the 60s, neither he nor Stan ever again reached that level of success. Jack did some important stuff for DC. It didn't sell well, and there were some editorial things that kind of canceled the fourth world, right? But
right.
Why do you think
that happened? That is the $64,000 question, and I don't have the answer for it. There's an entirely good. I mean, it could entirely be that there was this hot streak where these two men were together, and only in that chemistry did they create the work that they could have created. And that's the easiest answer, but who can explain why creative currents happen the way they do, and why sales currents happen even when things are created well, why things get picked up? It's you'll have the people who will just say that even though Jack's stuff was not as successful on either end necessarily, it was still successful, and Stan's stuff on either end didn't really go anywhere. But that still leaves you with the question of, well, why didn't Jack have as much success on either side? And I hate falling into the trap of saying there was a magical alchemy, but sometimes there's magical alchemy, whether it's alchemy between two people or between people and an audience and marketplace that is ready for the kind of thing that they're putting out. It's impossible to run a scientific study and tell you exactly why Stan and Jack achieved what they did with Marvel, and didn't achieve that on either side of that. But it is what it is. Sorry to have a disappointing answer to that, but
No. And Daniel asks, how did Stan feel about the surge and shift of online digital comics? And
Mhm.
on Webtoon, he had a book called Back.
Yeah, I mean, Stan didn't pay much attention to what was going on with that. He definitely was involved. When people would come to his second post Marvel company, POW Entertainment, with pitches for things to be associated with Stan, and Stan would hear them out and was not a total absentee landlord. I mean, when there were things that had his name attached to them, he knew what they were, but he wasn't spending a whole lot of time scoping out the future of comics. That was more just somebody at Webtoon had an idea for. I actually don't know the specific story of Back Channel. I should caution. There were a lot of projects to investigate about Stan, so that one I only know tangentially a bit about. But just from in general, my guess would be that was something that somebody who was working on a Webtoon came to POW with, or POW was looking for stuff involving Webtoons, but I don't think that was Stan going, I want to innovate in the new mode of infinite scroll vertical comics. I don't think that was really exactly his thing.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, because we are a little bit over now, and you've been incredibly generous with your
Oh,
time.
thank you. This
Thank
has
you
been a
for
lot of
that.
fun.
I did want to ask, so how was it releasing a book in the middle of a pandemic?
It was a little wild. It was supposed to come out in September, and then it didn't, which is probably for the best, because the week that it was going to come out was the week that Trump got COVID. So I don't think I would have had a whole lot of oxygen left in the room for discussion of my book. But it's been interesting. I mean, all the events have been like this. I've done a book tour without taking my sweatpants off. It's pretty wild.
And then just finally, you mentioned it, the Vince McMahon book. So
Yes.
that's next.
Yeah. So I'm realizing I have a good captive audience here, of Connecticans. I'm writing this biography of Vince McMahon, which is going to be a very different kind of biography just because of different levels of information that are available and kinds of impacts. But, obviously a lot of parallels in terms of these men who really changed their industries and their mediums. But I want to say, if anybody out there who's watching this has interesting Vince McMahon stories or WWE stories, I'd love to hear them. You can email me, and I'm all ears. You can be anonymous, any level of confidentiality that you want. I'm just looking for information. So if you want to hit me up, you can email me at abraham@abrahamriesman.com, and that's I before E, or you can DM me on Twitter or something.
Cool. I'm definitely looking forward to it. And again, everybody, the book is True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. It's so good, man. Really.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. This was a really good interview. You had really good questions. I appreciate that.
Well, you made it easy. And again, thank you so much for your time. You got to promise me that you're coming back for the Vince book.
Of course. Are you kidding me? It's a hometown crowd. I'll be there with spades. With bells on. That's what I meant to say.
I like to imagine that there is somewhere a vault of Vince McMahon archives.
I know. Wouldn't that be great? Someday, maybe I'll write the second volume then. But
well, Abraham, thank you so much for this.
Thank you. Okay. Be well.
Of the book. Everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you so much. Buy your copy of the book. It's up on our website. Abraham was nice enough to sign book plates for us, so we will have some copies. Everybody stay safe, be well, and good night.